Welcome back to Vintage Quilting Part 3. In this last session, we'll be talking about the quilting on our mock vintage quilt. The first thing you need to do is to layer all your pieces and prepare it for quilting. I have a 45-inch square of batting, backing, and the matte satin that I have for the mounting fabric all put together. I have carefully also layered the mock vintage piece on top of the other three pieces, and that is also pinned in place. I began the quilting on this wall hanging by concentrating on the mock vintage hexagons. I drew out a series of 1-inch grids on each hexagon, following the sides of the piece. You can see in this drawing that they had been drawn out 1 inch from the edges. After that, I used a fill in every other block to give the high and low effect to the quilting. Now when you're doing this quilting, of course you're going around the embroidery, and I did not quilt through it, I quilted around it, but you're just going to think about where you want to go next. So after I finish this square, I want to go up to the top that's just adjacent to this one. But if I go just from the bottom, I'm going to be stuck up there. So I'm going to backtrack up to the top and work my way back down again. Now I'm going to go to the adjacent square there, but I'm going to go back up to the top so I don't forget about this little block sitting up there by itself. Then I can continue on to the other squares. So you always want to stop and think out where you're going to go next and plan your strategy as you're doing this stitch. This type of quilting is really quite easy. It's just a simple back and forth. It's almost mesmerizing as you do it, but it leaves quite an impact, particularly when it's done around applique or embroidery in this case, because it really makes it stand out. So as you can see, I did the checkerboard in all 6 outer hexagons. The center, I put feathers surrounding the bird because I wanted to tie in the feathers that I would be adding to this piece later. The next quilting that I did on this wall hanging was the corners and the outer edges. I like adding my outer borders before doing the centers. It sort of contains everything for me. Now these outer borders contain wishbone quilting stitches. It also has some tiny meandering and some stencil work in the center. I've included this design for the corners in your workbook. Just like the checkerboard pattern, the wishbone quilt stitch is also very easy. What you want to do is to try to maintain an equal parallel distance between the upswings on the diagonal swing of this stitch. Now you can make those upswings closer or further apart depending on how tight you want this quilting to be. It was really quite effective on the satin. It really made a nice effect. As you begin to stitch the arced portion of the wishbones, you'll notice that the closer you get to the top, the further apart the top loops will be as compared to the bottom. This is to allow your stitches to radiate to the same circumference as the arc that you've put on your fabric. You see how they're starting to get a little bit further apart up there? You just want to keep maintaining the bottom as closely as possible, and then you'll go back to the same type of stitch you were using when you first started. The whole time you're keeping those diagonal upswings pretty equal distance apart. These quilting stitches are basically fillers. The one that's going on right now is the Pebble fill, and it looks like a snowman body, and now we're putting the head on, and now we're putting the head on in another direction, and that's all it is just circling around. Now if you get into an area where you can't get a full circle, let's just do a half a circle, just like that, and then continue on with your circles. They can be large, they can be small, or as on my quilt, you'll see a combination of both for a little variety. Stitch that we'll use in the corners is the meander or stippling stitch. Now if you'll notice, in comparison with the pebbles, this is really small, but the purpose of it is to really push the batting down to allow whatever you're trying to accentuate to pop up, and this is what this stitch is used for. Now for my absolute favorite part of the quilting, that's the feathers. The first thing I do when doing these feathers is I stitch some vines for the feathers to grow along. I don't put any end caps on these vines. I just stitch the curve, and then I slowly backtrack out of that curve until I get to the place that I want to be to next. Because we have so many odd shapes around the hexagons, we might need to add a little bit more right in through here, so we'll add another curve. Once we have our vine all stitched out, we'll go back to the beginning where we'll start our feathers. Now those of you who know me, we do the bird's wing, we go around the sun and back again. We're doing the same thing here, but this time we're doing bump feathers. So pay attention here, we're going to go up, we're going to bump onto the feather before it, come part way back that feather, and then make another bump and back to the wing. Doing these bump back feathers allow you to get really elaborate with the feathers as we go on. Right now we're inside a curve, so we can't get so elaborate. We just want to make sure our feathers lay down the way they should in the curve. So you have to have an imaginary mark in the center, and that's the line you don't want to go past when you're doing these feathers. Now when you get to a crossroads like this, we're going to stitch an upright feather right in that crossroads. That's going to be our basis for both directions. So we're going to swing way out and hit that one right in the top of the center. And now we can get really flamboyant with these feathers. Before we were confined to a tight curve. Now we can really let it rip and do some really fancy feather work. Just remember, we're coming down to some smaller feathers now, so we want to kind of bring the size down so that we're corresponding to those feathers as well. Otherwise, it wouldn't look quite right. Now we're going to go back up this vine. We're going to go to that feather that we stitched straight up and down. We're going to swing around and we're going to hit that one at the top as well. Halfway around there, we're going to swing around again. Now when you're bringing those feathers into your vine like this, if you can try to do that at a 45-degree angle at least, that gives you depth to your feathers. They almost look like they're curling up out of that spine. Now we're coming back into another curve. So if you look, you'll see these feathers are almost laying down on top of each other. We still have that imaginary dot in the middle of this curve that we have to observe so that we have room for the rest of the feathers to be stitched. And we're going to finish this up. Now we need to get across to the last curve that we put on there. So what we're going to do is we're going to do a little bit of echo stitching to work our way down to the very beginning where we started. So we're just going to very carefully go around all the feathers. And we're almost there. You don't really want to rush this. Just enjoy the process. And we're just about there. And here we are. Now we're back down to the bottom so we can work our way back up the other side of the vine. Now I'd already stitched a feather below that, so again you want to make sure you allow for that so that when you do your echo stitching around you have enough room. Always keep that in mind. Now we're coming up on a curve, so as much as I'd like to get flamboyant again with these feathers, we're going to run out of room. So I also have another curve that I have to deal with, so I made a small feather there and curved the other one over top. Let's do that again so you can see it. You see how it made it sit down in there? We're just going to keep curving those feathers like so. Making them go in different directions also gives your feathers so much more character. So we're coming in on this curve now. Remember, we have to have that imaginary dot in the center where we don't want to cross over so that we have room for the feathers that have to go all the way around this curve. Now, as you see here, our feathers are really laying down in this curve. They're getting really lazy, but that's the only way they're going to fit. And we're going to bring it back out. We're going to meet up with the vine. Now is a decision point. Where do we go? Let's go back down that vine again. Ah, what do we have here? Another crossroads. So let's stitch that petal so we can go off of that in either direction. And let's start. We're just constantly bumping back. Now we're out in the open here. We can start getting real flamboyant again. Really bring those feathers out. Really fill in the space. The purpose of quilting, remember, is to give you a lot of highs and lows and shadows. When you have some big feathers like this versus some smaller feathers, it really brings those mountain peaks into your quilting. So we're going to keep going around, and you see I'm starting to get a little smaller because we're going to meet up with some smaller feathers here, and we don't want the ones we're doing now to be out of place. So we've got to keep that in mind as well. We're going to put one more feather in here. Now the decision is, where do we go from here? Well, I need to get over to the other side, so why not do a little bit of echo stitching? That'll get me right to where I need to be without having to do additional stitching on these stems. Now remember, when you're doing this quilting, a lot of people freak if they're not right on top of their backtracking. When you're stitching this with a finer thread and it's the same color as your background fabric, you're not going to see a lot of the bloopers that you see when you're stitching with a high contrast thread on a dark fabric like this. So relax, enjoy the process, and when you're done and you stand away from it and look, you're not going to even see those. So we're coming down to the finish line here. Again, we're on the outside, so we can really spread those feathers out, get really fancy. Just remember, as we get closer to the tip, where the feathers are small, we need to size them down a little bit so they don't seem out of place. Just like that. And I think we can put one more in there. Now what are we going to do? This is a decision point. Well, we need to get back down to the bottom. So we're just going to go ahead and echo quilt all around here. One of the advantages of doing the echo quilting is that it helps to make your feather pop up. It's pushing the batting down very close to the feather. It almost makes a shadow line. So it makes your feathers more defined. Now we're going to work our way back down this feather. Work our way out here. And let's do a little echo quilting in the middle. Now this really isn't necessary, and you'll see why in a little while, because we're going to do something more to this feather to really enhance it. So we could have left that echoing out if we so desired. So our feathers are all stitched, and they look pretty with the echo stitching around them. But there's still something missing. Let me show you what we're going to do to enhance it even more. Remember all those pebbles? This is what we're going to use those for, and what a difference it makes. I hope you've enjoyed this series of lessons on how to create your very own mock vintage quilt. Until next time,